Arizona Territory. Summer, 1883. The woman stood in the ashes of her burned cabin, her hands still covered in blood, the blood of the man who'd dropped to the ground in front of her, taken by a rifle shot fired from the dark tree line. The boy was coughing somewhere behind her. The fire was still roaring. And from the trees, nothing. No sound, no mercy. She looked down at the man lying in the dirt, the man no one in this valley had heard laugh in 10 years, and pressed both hands hard against the wound in his chest. "Stay with me," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "You hear me? You don't get to go anywhere." He opened his eyes, looked up at the night sky, and said just barely, just enough for her to catch it, "Not going anywhere." This is the story of a woman who arrived alone on 30 dry acres, a man who forgot how to laugh for a decade, and a truth buried so long that an entire valley paid for it in blood. Watch now before you regret missing a single word. The stagecoach lurched to a stop, and Ridgefield Valley announced itself with a mouthful of red dust. Eudora Vance pressed her fingers to the window frame and squinted out at the town through the grit-streaked glass. It wasn't much. A main street of sun-bleached timber buildings, a water trough with a cracked rim, and 3 hounds sleeping in the dirt, like they'd given up on everything. The mountains behind the town were magnificent violet and ancient, but the town itself looked like it had been dropped there by accident and hadn't yet decided whether to stay. She pushed the door open before the driver could offer his hand and stepped down into the August heat. 20 days on a stagecoach. 20 days of stale biscuits, strangers' elbows, and roads that seemed designed by someone who hated spines. She was 28 years old and felt twice it. Her dark traveling dress was gray with dust. Her braid had given up its shape somewhere around the New Mexico border. She carried a worn leather medicine chest in her right hand and a canvas satchel over her left shoulder, and in the pocket of her skirt sat $12.40 in coin, a folded land deed, and a one-way ticket stub she'd kept as a reminder that she wasn't going back. The deed was for 30 acres called Cedar Creek. It had belonged to her father's younger brother, a man she'd met twice in her life. He'd died without children and left the land to the only person in the Vance family he'd considered worth a damn. He'd written that in the letter, plain as morning, worth a damn. Eudora had read that sentence 4 times before she folded the letter up and began packing her trunk. She was not going to marry Edmund Whitlock. She was not going to stand in a parlor in Columbus, Ohio, and smile while her father traded her to a man twice her age to settle a business debt she had no part in making. She was a physician, or as close to one as a woman was permitted to be in 1883. Herbal medicine, wound care, fever management. She had learned at her grandmother's knee and spent 6 years refining that knowledge on her own, while her male counterparts received diplomas and offices. She had skill, and she had nerve, and she was going to use both. Arizona Territory could be hot enough to crack stone. She'd known that coming in. She squared her shoulders and looked for the boarding house. Moira Sterling's establishment sat at the eastern end of the main street, 2 stories of solid timber, with a porch wide enough to park a wagon on. A painted sign above the door read Sterling Rooms and Supper Respectable Guests Only. The word respectable had been underlined twice, which Eudora found both amusing and slightly alarming. She climbed the porch steps, pushed inside, and was immediately hit by the smell of roasting pork and candle wax. The dining room occupied most of the ground floor. Long plank tables, oil lamps, a half-dozen men in trail clothes, hunched over plates, a woman behind the back counter who looked like she'd been arguing with the world for 60 years and was winning. That would be Moira. She was compact and iron-haired and had the kind of eyes that took inventory of a person in about 4 seconds and generally didn't like what they found. She looked at Eudora, did her inventory, and set down the ladle she was holding. "Room?" she said. "Room and board," Eudora said. "If you have it, I have it." Moira pulled a ledger from under the counter. $1.50 a week. Suppers at 6. I don't abide whiskey in the rooms, fighting in the hall, or disrespect at my table. You want a bath, you haul your own water from the pump out back. That seems fair, Eudora said, and she meant it. She was signing her name in the ledger when the front door banged open. The man who stumbled in was young 22, maybe 23, and he was bleeding badly. His right forearm was wrapped in a filthy bandana that had soaked through entirely. He was thin in the way that meant not enough meals, with trail-worn boots that were more whole than leather, and a hat with a dent in the brim that hadn't been fixed, because fixing things cost money. He pressed his arm against his chest and looked around with the dazed expression of a man who'd been moving on instinct for the last hour. "Ma'am," he said to nobody in particular, "I caught myself on some fencing wire. I can't get it to stop." Two of the men at the nearest table looked up, looked at him, and looked back at their plates. One of them said, without lowering his fork, "Go around back, son. You're dripping on the floor." Another laughed, low and short. The young cowboy's face went red. He swayed slightly. He was losing more blood than he probably understood. Eudora was already moving. She set her medicine chest on the nearest table and unlatched it before she'd even fully pulled out the chair beside her. Inside, silk thread, curved needles packed in a cloth roll, a bottle of carbolic solution, a flask of clean whiskey she kept for exactly this kind of moment, and a dozen small jars of dried herbs and tinctures organized by use. She knew where everything was in the dark. She'd repacked this chest every night for 6 years. "Sit," she said to the young man, and pointed to the chair in front of her. He sat. She took his arm, unwound the bandana, and looked at the wound. It was a long, diagonal tier-iron cable. By the look of it, rough-edged and deep enough that the muscle underneath was visible. Not fatal if treated. Fatal if left alone much longer. "This is going to sting considerably," she said. "Hold the table edge." He grabbed the table edge with his good hand, and she went to work. She poured the carbolic first, then the whiskey, and she didn't rush it. The young man hissed through his teeth and held on. Around the room, a few more heads turned. Moira had come out from behind the counter and stood with her arms folded watching. Someone at the back table muttered something about filth being dragged into a supper room. Eudora threaded her needle. She was calm with her hands. Always had been. Her grandmother had told her once that healing hands needed to be smarter than the brain running them. They needed to move without hesitation, because hesitation was its own kind of harm. She pulled the first stitch, even and clean, and kept her attention on the wound. She heard every word being said in that room. Another comment. Something about the cowboy's boots. Something about the cost of clean tablecloths. She tied off the third stitch and looked up. The men who'd been talking weren't looking at her. They were looking at their plates now, or out the window, or somewhere that wasn't her face. She took that in. Then she said it. Her voice wasn't loud. She didn't need it to be. A poor cowboy's blood runs just as red and hurts just as deep as the wealthiest ranchers in this valley. She looked at the room. Not at any one man, at all of them. A human being's worth isn't measured by how clean his hands are or how heavy his pockets feel. The room was quiet enough to hear the lamp flame flicker. Moira Sterling, behind them all, made a sound that might have been a grunt of agreement or just a clearing of the throat, but her expression had shifted barely. But Eudora caught it. Nobody said anything else. She finished the stitching. 8 sutures, all even. She pressed a folded cloth soaked in yarrow tincture against the wound. Yarrow was a fine clotting agent, better than most people knew, and began wrapping his arm with clean linen from her chest. "Keep this dry for 3 days," she said to the young man. "After that, keep it clean. If it turns red and hot around the edges, find me immediately. I'll be at Cedar Creek." He blinked at her. He looked somewhat stunned, which was understandable given the events of the last 20 minutes. "How much do I owe you?" She looked at his boots. "At the hat with the broken dent. What have you got?" He dug in his shirt pocket and produced 32 cents. "That'll do," she said. He blinked again. "That's ma'am. That's nowhere near." "It's what you have," Eudora said, "which makes it exactly enough." She cleaned her needle, rolled it back in its cloth, and latched her medicine chest. The young man sat for a moment longer, looking at his wrapped arm, then put his hat back on and stood up carefully. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "Get some food in you before you leave," she said. "You're pale." Moira was already setting a plate on the table in front of him. She didn't say anything about it. She just set it down and went back to her counter. Eudora washed her hands at the basin Moira brought out without being asked. She found a seat at the end of a table and accepted a plate of roasted pork and boiled carrots, and she ate it methodically while the room gradually returned to its normal noise. Men talked. Forks scraped. Someone outside shouted at a horse. After supper, she sat with Moira at the counter while the other guests filed out. Moira had produced 2 cups of coffee black, bitter, strong enough to stand up and walk, and she pushed one across to Eudora without ceremony. "Cedar Creek," Moira said. "That's right. You inherited it." "I did." Moira wrapped both hands around her cup. "How much do you know about it?" Eudora considered the question. She knew it was 30 acres of scrubland bordering a larger ranch to the north. She knew the soil was mostly dry clay, but had some workable patches where she'd planned to put in an herb garden. She knew there was a small cabin and a well. "Enough to start," she said. Moira looked at her with those inventory eyes. "The well's been dry for 2 years," she said flatly. "Not a drop. People tried to warn your uncle before he passed, but he was a stubborn old man. Creek hasn't run either. Whatever was feeding that land dried up and nobody knows where it went." Eudora set her coffee cup down. A dry well, 30 acres of dry clay, $12.40. She sat with that for a moment. It would have been a reasonable moment to cry, or to ask about a seat on the next eastbound stage, or to start calculating how quickly she could draft a letter back to Columbus conceding defeat. She picked her cup back up. "Where's the nearest water source?" she said. Moira looked at her for a long beat. Then something happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. "Dry Wash Creek, about 3 miles south. Still has a trickle this time of year. Is it accessible by wagon? With the right wheels? Then I'll need to find a water barrel," Eudora said. "2 if I can manage." Moira looked at her a while longer. Then she got up, went to a cabinet at the back of the room, and came back with a small jar of something dark and sweet-smelling. She set it in front of Eudora. "Wild plum preserves," she said. "I make them in July. You look like you haven't eaten anything good in a month." 20 days, Eudora said. "Same thing." Eudora unscrewed the jar and took a small spoonful. It was extraordinary. Summer and sugar and something tart underneath. She sat quietly for a moment with the taste of it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it." Moira sat back down and folded her hands on the counter. "The big ranch to your north is the Broken Wheel. Gabriel Ryder runs it. He's the foreman, been there 10 years. He's not friendly, but he's fair. You'll want to know who your neighbors are." "Ryder?" Eudora repeated. "He lost his wife 10 years back. Flash, flood in the wash. He's been," Moira paused, choosing her words the way a careful person selects their footing on bad ground. "He's been quiet since. Works hard. Doesn't cause trouble. Doesn't talk much either. Some folks think he forgot how. And the land to the south belongs to Harrison Montgomery." Moira's voice shifted. It didn't get louder or harder, but something went out of it. The small warmth that had been there a moment ago. "He owns most of what you can see from any hill in this valley. The biggest cattle operation in 3 counties. He's polished and he's powerful, and—" She stopped. "And?" Eudora said. Moira looked into her coffee. "Just keep your deed somewhere safe," she said. "That's all." It was clearly not all. But Moira's tone had closed on the subject like a door, and Eudora was tired enough to let it rest for tonight. She finished the preserves. She thanked Moira again, picked up her medicine chest and her canvas satchel, and climbed the narrow stairs to her room on the 2nd floor. The room was small but clean. A single window looked out over the back of the town and into open country beyond pale scrubland and distant red rock formations going purple in the early dusk. A washstand with a china basin, a narrow iron bed with a quilt in a log cabin pattern, a hook on the wall for her coat. She set the medicine chest under the bed where she always kept it. She hung her coat on the hook. She sat on the edge of the mattress and let the room hold still around her for a minute. Ohio was 2,000 miles behind her. Edmund Whitlock was 2,000 miles behind her. Her father's disappointed face, the particular look he got when she declined to be useful in the ways he wanted, that was 2,000 miles behind her. She pulled the deed from her skirt pocket and unfolded it on her knee. 30 acres, Cedar Creek, Arizona Territory. Her name on the paper. Not her father's name, not a husband's name. Hers. The well was dry. She refolded the deed and put it back in her pocket. 30 acres of dry land with no water was still 30 acres of her own. She had her medicine chest and her skills, and the knowledge that she'd just stitched a man's arm closed in a room full of people who didn't think he deserved the chair he was sitting in, and the world had kept turning just fine anyway. She'd get water barrels. She'd haul from Drywash Creek if she had to. She'd figure out the well. She'd grow something in that clay soil if she had to coax every single plant by hand. Outside, the last of the light was going. The mountains turned from violet to charcoal. Somewhere down the street, a screen door banged. A dog barked once and stopped. Arizona Territory, as foreign and dry and enormous as anything she'd ever imagined. She lay back on the quilt, without undressing, and stared at the ceiling. And she thought about what Moira had said. Gabriel Ryder. He's been quiet. Some folks think he forgot how. She wondered about that, about what it cost a person. 10 years of silence. Whether silence was a choice you made, or a thing that made itself inside you after enough grief piled up. She didn't have an answer, but she filed the question away. The way she filed away everything useful carefully, in a place she could find it again. In 20 days, she'd crossed half a continent to stand on her own ground. The ground happened to be dry. That was a problem to solve, not a reason to leave. She closed her eyes, and the ceiling of the room at Moira Sterling's boarding house was the first ceiling in 3 weeks she hadn't shared with 5 strangers, and that alone was enough to be grateful for. She was asleep before the last light left the sky. Down the hall, through the wall, and out into the night air of Ridgefield Valley, the word had already started moving, the way words do in small places. Did you hear? New woman at Moira's. Patched up a broke cowboy on the supper table. Said his blood was worth the same as anybody's. Said it right out loud, plain as you please. The story moved from the boarding house to the saloon, from the saloon to the livery, from the livery to a bunkhouse on the northern edge of town, where a group of ranch hands were playing cards by lantern light. One of them told it. Another one laughed. A third one said he wished he'd seen it. And 14 miles north, at the Broken Wheel Ranch, a man with a crippled leg and 10 years of silence sat alone on his porch in the dark and looked at the stars, the way he did every night, and knew nothing yet of the woman who had just arrived in his valley. That would change. Everything would change. But not tonight. Tonight he sat alone, and the stars were very far away, and the valley was quiet, and Gabriel Ryder had not laughed in 10 years. 3 days after arriving in Ridgefield Valley, Eudora had already developed a system. She woke before sunrise. She hitched the mule she'd rented from the livery, a stubborn, gray-faced animal she'd named Clement, after a preacher she'd never liked, to a wooden sled, 2 empty barrels. She drove 3 miles south to Drywash Creek, which was barely a creek at this point in the summer, but still had enough of a trickle to fill the barrels if she was patient. She was patient. She filled them, drove back, and spent the morning moving water from barrel to bucket to garden, and to the clay jugs she kept inside the cabin. Then she started the actual work of the day. Cedar Creek's 30 acres were mostly scrub and hardpan, but the southeast quarter had some promise. The soil there was darker, less cracked, and when she dug down 6 inches, she found a layer of clay loam that held moisture better than anything on the surface. She'd already cleared a patch, 10 feet by 12, and put in the beginnings of a herb bed, yarrow and valerian, from seeds she'd brought from Ohio, a row of calendula, some pennyroyal near the edge that she hoped would discourage insects. It wasn't a garden yet. It was an intention. But intentions were where everything started. The cabin itself was standing, which was more than she'd feared. The roof needed patching in 2 places. The door hung crooked on its hinges. The stone fireplace worked fine, which she'd confirmed by starting a small fire her first night and watching the smoke go straight up instead of back into the room. She'd fixed the door herself with a hand plane she borrowed from Moira and returned the same afternoon. The roof patches were next on her list, but they required wood shingles she'd have to buy in town when she could spare the coin. $12.10 now. She'd spent 30 cents on nails. She didn't tell anyone how close the margins were. It wasn't anyone's business. She'd figure it out. It was on the 4th morning, a Thursday, cloudless, already hot by 8 o'clock, that everything went sideways. She heard it before she saw it. A deep, rhythmic crashing. The sound of something large moving with absolute disregard for anything in its path. Then her fence. The rickety post and rail fence on the north boundary she'd been meaning to reinforce gave way with a sound like a gunshot, and the bull came through it like it had never been there. He was enormous, red-brown and massive across the shoulders, with a neck like a tree trunk and small, furious eyes that were the particular shade of black that meant nothing good for anyone nearby. He hit the garden at full speed. He didn't even seem to notice the garden. He just kept moving, and the garden stopped existing in any meaningful way. Eudora stood 10 feet away with a bucket in her hand. She set the bucket down slowly. The bull's head swung toward her, and those black eyes had found her, and he stamped one front hoof into what had been her valerian row. Stamped it like he had a grievance with valerian specifically. She did not run. Running was exactly wrong with an animal like this. It triggered the chase instinct, and a 2,000-pound bull would always win that argument. She stood absolutely still and thought. She heard hoofbeats from the north boundary. The horseman came over the broken fence line at a controlled canter, pulling up about 30 yards out when he saw the bull between them. He had a lasso already in his hand, coiled and ready. He dismounted in one smooth motion, and then she saw the hitch in his step, a pronounced drag of the left leg that he moved through without slowing, like a man who'd made his peace with pain a long time ago and wasn't going to let it be a topic of conversation. He was tall, late 30s, maybe early 40s. Dark hair gone gray at the temples, a weathered face that had spent a decade or more under an Arizona sun. He looked at the bull, looked at her, and said nothing. He started moving wide around the bull's left side, lasso ready. The bull's head swung toward him. Eudora saw immediately that this wasn't going to work. The bull was too agitated, too much adrenaline running through him. The moment this man got within range, the animal was going to charge, and a lasso thrown at a charging bull at close range was going to end badly. She needed to slow the bull down first. She turned and moved quickly but quietly into the cabin, not running, just moving with purpose, and found what she was looking for. A small tin bucket she used for soaking dried herbs. She grabbed the bunch of dried sage hanging from the ceiling beam, the big bundle she'd brought from Ohio and hadn't yet sorted. She went to the fireplace where the morning coals were still orange. She crushed a large handful of dried sage between her palms and dropped it directly on the coals. The smoke came up gray and thick and fragrant. She grabbed the tin bucket and used it to fan the smoke toward the open door and out into the yard. It wasn't a bellows and it wasn't elegant, but it moved the smoke where she needed it to go. Sage smoke, dense, aromatic, disorienting to an animal's senses in ways that were useful right now. The bull's nose was his primary information system, and she was about to flood it with something overpowering. It took less than a minute. The bull's head came up. His nostrils worked. That massive body, which had been coiled for a charge, slowed. His stamping foot went still. He swung his head from side to side with a new confusion. Not calm exactly, but interrupted. The rage in him had hit a wall it didn't understand. She came to the doorway and kept fanning. The smoke rolled out into the yard in a steady stream. The man with the lasso had stopped moving. He was watching her. She looked at him and made a small gesture with her free hand. "Go now," he went. He moved in on the bull's left side with the rope swinging low and easy, not overhead where it would spook the animal, but low and quiet. And when he threw, it was one clean motion, smooth and economical. And the lasso dropped over the bull's neck, and he had him. He dug his boots in and leaned back on the rope, and the bull, still muddled by the sage smoke, pulled but didn't charge. And within 2 minutes, the animal was standing with his nose down and his sides heaving, well and truly caught. The man tied the other end of the rope to the post that was still standing at the corner of the broken fence. Then he stood with his hands on his hips and looked at the garden. There wasn't much to look at. The bull had taken out everything except the calendula at the far edge and a few pennyroyal plants that had been protected by the low post they were growing beside. 10 days of work, just gone. Eudora came out of the cabin and stood next to the ruins. She looked at the calendula, still standing. Good. She looked at what had been the valerian row. The earth was churned up completely. The small seedlings that had been coming in, so well just mashed into the dirt. She looked at the yarrow. Same. She walked slowly along what had been the edge of the bed and surveyed the damage with the methodical attention she gave to most disasters, which was to understand them completely before deciding what to feel about them. It was a lot of work gone. It would set her back at least 2 weeks. More if the seeds she'd been preserving for the second planting had been scattered. The man came to stand a few feet away. He had his hat in his hand. "That's my bull," he said. "He got out of the north pasture this morning. I take full responsibility." His voice was low, a little rusty, like a door that didn't open often. "I can see he's yours," Eudora said. "Broken wheel brand." He looked at her. "Gabriel Ryder. I run the Broken Wheel. Eudora Vance. I'm the new owner of Cedar Creek." She paused. "What's left of it?" He looked at the garden again. A muscle moved in his jaw. "I'll replace what he destroyed. The bull himself, as compensation. He's a young one, not yet in full breeding service. Worth about $40. That should cover the seeds, the fence repair, and the labor." Eudora looked at him. He was watching her with dark, careful eyes that revealed very little. "That's generous," she said, "but it's more than what was lost." "The fence was mine to maintain," he said. "The north line is my responsibility. I let it go too long." "Even so." She looked at the bull, which was standing quietly now, with his nose down, the sage smoke beginning to dissipate in the morning heat. "A fair trade is better than charity. I'll take the bull, but in exchange, I'll fix your fence gate on the north line. I saw it when I arrived. The hinge is gone and the latch is stripped. I can fix both." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her the way Moira had looked at her, with that same careful inventory. But there was something different in it, less assessment and more puzzlement. Like she was a problem he hadn't been given the right tools for. "You know gates?" he said. "I know hinges," she said. "I know how to use a drill and a wrench, and I know how to set a latch in wood that isn't going to strip again in 2 months. My uncle taught me." She paused. He was a practical man. Gabriel Ryder said nothing. He put his hat back on. She took that for a yes. She untied her apron, a canvas one she wore for garden work, now covered in a remarkable quantity of Arizona soil, and began balling it up to shake it out. It was beyond hope, honestly. There was a dirt line along the hem that was going to require soaking. She gave it 3 good snaps in the air anyway, which accomplished nothing, and then she did what she sometimes did when there was nothing practical left to do about a situation. She started singing. It was an old Ohio folk song her grandmother had sung, about a river and a man who lost his hat in it and spent 3 verses trying to get it back. It wasn't a song that had survived its trip to the Arizona Territory in particularly good shape. She'd forgotten the second verse somewhere around Kansas, and she had never, by anyone's accounting, been gifted with a singing voice. She knew this. She sang anyway, because the garden was gone, and the apron was ruined, and the heat was already climbing, and it was either sing or sit down in the dirt and feel sorry for herself, and she had already decided early in life that feeling sorry for herself was an indulgence she couldn't afford. She was on the third verse. The one where the hat finally comes back down the river wearing somebody else's ribbon. When she heard it, it started low, like something that had been stored somewhere for a very long time, and was having trouble finding the exit. Then it got bigger. It was a laugh. A real one, deep and full, and coming from somewhere genuine in the man's chest, rolling out into the morning air and bouncing off the rock face of the canyon wall to the east. Gabriel Ryder stood with his hand on his horse's neck and laughed at her singing, and it was so unexpected, so large and so real, that it seemed to startle even him, like he hadn't known his own laugh would sound like that anymore. Eudora stopped singing and looked at him. He stopped, almost caught himself, and then laughed again. It was a good laugh. She'd spent enough time around people who performed their emotions and people who felt them genuinely to know the difference. And this was genuine. Something had gotten through whatever 10 years of quiet had built around this man, and it had gotten through fast from the most unexpected direction possible, which was her singing a folk song about a hat. She considered being offended. She wasn't. Particularly, she started laughing too, because there was something contagious in the sound of it, and because she knew exactly how bad the singing was, and it was funny. Down at the livery, the stable boy, working the morning shift, would later swear that he heard a laugh come from the direction of Cedar Creek that morning. A big, echoing laugh that went around the canyon walls and came back twice, and that he had never in 10 years of living in Ridgefield Valley heard anything like it from that direction. He was right. Nobody had. An hour later, Eudora had salvaged what seeds she could from the churned earth, wrapped them in a damp cloth, and set them in the shade of the cabin wall. The calendula and pennyroyal. She replanted at the edge of the cleared patch. She made a list of what she'd need to start again seeds from the general store. Another bag of the bone meal she'd been mixing into the clay to improve it. Gabriel Ryder had taken his bowl and left with a short nod that she was beginning to understand was his version of a full conversation. But he'd stopped at the fence line and looked back at her once. She'd held up her hand. He'd nodded again. Then he was gone. She sat down on her porch steps in the afternoon heat and did her accounts in the small leather notebook she kept for that purpose. Bull $40 on the asset side. That was substantial. That changed the margins considerably. An animal like that, properly managed, was a foundation. Cedar Creek had one more thing going for it than it had this morning. She wrote it all down and closed the notebook and looked out over the scrubland. She could hear, somewhere far north, the faint echo of activity at the broken wheel, the sound of a working ranch. Horses and voices and the distant bark of a dog. Gabriel Ryder, who hadn't spoken more than 3 words in 10 years, had just laughed loud enough to shake the canyon walls. She wondered if he knew what that meant. She suspected he didn't yet, but she filed it away in the same careful place. She kept everything useful, and she went back to work. The boy appeared on a Tuesday at first light, which told her something. People who came to Cedar Creek at midday or afternoon were curious or lost or selling something. People who came at first light, moving low and careful along the scrub brush on the eastern boundary, were trying not to be seen. Eudora was already up. She was always up before the light. She saw him from the corner of her eye while she was refilling the water buckets from the barrels on the sled. A small figure, 12 years old by the look of him, moving in a wide arc toward the back of the cabin, where she kept the food box on a shelf under the lean. She didn't shout. She didn't reach for anything. She just went on with her work, keeping her movements slow and ordinary until the boy had gotten to the lean-to and was working at the clasp on the food box with the focused attention of someone who really needed what was inside it. Then she walked around the corner. He ran, or tried to. He was fast, but the ground was uneven and he was small, and she didn't chase him anyway. She just said, in a normal voice, "The cornbread is in the cloth-wrapped packet on the left side. There's dried beef under it. The biscuits from yesterday are a little hard, but still worth eating." He stopped. He turned around slowly, like he was expecting something bad, and was trying to get a head start on bracing for it. He was thin, not the thin of a growing boy who hadn't caught up yet, the thin of a boy who wasn't eating enough and hadn't been for a while. His face was sharp-featured and guarded, with dark eyes that took in everything at once and trusted none of it. He had a bruise along his left cheekbone that was 4 or 5 days old, fading from purple to greenish yellow. He was waiting for her to do something to him. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. "You hungry?" she said. He said nothing. "Come around front. I'll make breakfast." She turned and went to the cabin, and after a long moment, she heard his footsteps behind her. His name, she got out of him in pieces over the next half hour. "Thaddeus Miller." "Thad," he said, when she called him Thaddeus. He ate 3 biscuits and most of a piece of dried beef and 2 slices of the cornbread in a focused, methodical way that suggested he'd learned not to let himself feel hungry until food was actually in front of him, because feeling it before that just made things worse. She didn't ask about the bruise directly. She noted it. She set a small cup of cold chamomile tea in front of him. Without comment, chamomile was an anti-inflammatory, and it helped with the residual pain of old bruising, and watched him drink it, without knowing why she'd given it to him. When he'd eaten enough to relax slightly, she asked if he lived in town. He looked at the table. "Used to? And now?" "Around." He said it with a shrug that was trying to be indifferent. It wasn't quite working. She refilled his cup. "I'm going to need help clearing brush on the south quarter today. The pay is 10 cents for the morning and lunch. You interested?" He looked up at her with those guarded eyes. "Why?" "Because I need help. And you're here," she said. "And because brush doesn't clear itself." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." She gave him a pair of old work gloves she had in the cabin. Too big for his hands, but that was better than torn-up palms. And they went to work on the south quarter, where a stand of dried mesquite had been slowly encroaching on the corner she was planning to clear for a second garden plot. He was a good worker. That surprised some people. She imagined probably the same people who'd given him that bruise. He was efficient with the axe handle she gave him, and he didn't complain about the heat, and he kept working even when she took a water break, until she told him to stop and drink, or he'd overheat, at which point he stopped and drank. Around mid-morning, while they were hauling the cut brush to a pile at the edge of the property, she asked how he'd gotten to Ridgefield Valley. He answered slowly, like he was deciding how much to say. His father had died when he was 2. His mother had died 3 years ago of fever. He'd been passed between various families in the valley, none of whom particularly wanted him. "Why not?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father's name was Jonah Miller." She was looking at him when he said it, which meant she saw what the name did to his face. He said it the way a person says a thing they've said too many times to strangers braced for the reaction. Already tired of it. She didn't know the name, she said so. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe, that she didn't already have an opinion. He looked at the ground and said, "He was driving a wagon 10 years ago. There was a flood. The wagon went into the wash, and 2 people died." He paused. "People say he was drunk." She waited. "He wasn't," Thad said. "He didn't drink." His voice was flat and certain when he said it. Not defensive. Just certain with the specific certainty of a person who knows a thing is true even though no one around them believes it. She looked at the bruise on his cheekbone. "Who gave you that?" she said. He shrugged. "Boys in town." "For your father's name?" He shrugged again. She didn't push it. She made a note of it in the same part of her mind where she was already storing questions about Ridgefield Valley and the flood 10 years ago and the name Jonah Miller and the look on Thad's face when he said it. They worked until midday. She made lunch cornbread and leftover bean soup and a peach she'd bought in town, and they ate on the porch steps in the shade of the overhang. That was when Gabriel Ryder came. She heard the horse first, then saw him coming up the path from the north boundary, moving at a slow walk on a big chestnut mare. He pulled up at the edge of the clearing, and his eyes went from Eudora to the boy on the porch steps. He went very still. It was the kind of stillness that wasn't calm. It was the stillness of a man who had looked up and seen something he wasn't prepared for. His face didn't change. It was already a face that didn't change much, but something happened behind his eyes that Eudora caught and held. Thad looked up, saw who it was, and put his lunch bowl down. He stood up slowly. He had the posture of a boy who had learned that standing up was safer than being caught sitting. Gabriel Ryder said nothing. He sat on his horse and looked somewhere past the boy, or maybe through him, and then he said to Eudora, in a carefully level voice, "I came to check on the fence post. The one we put in yesterday." "It's holding fine," she said. He nodded. He didn't look at Thad. There was a silence that was far too large for the small porch of a 30-acre homestead in Arizona territory. Eudora stood up. She knew what she'd heard in town. She'd gotten the story from Moira in pieces, supplemented by what the dry goods owner had mentioned while she was buying nails, and what she'd now just heard from the boy himself. She knew about Jonah Miller and the flood and Gabriel Ryder's wife. She'd put the pieces in order in her head, the way she always put things in order, and the picture they made was not a simple one. She knew that Gabriel paid for Thad's school clothes. Moira had mentioned it. He did it quietly, through the dry goods owner, money left with no note, no name, just money for a boy's clothing because nobody else was providing it, and she knew that he couldn't look at the boy. She walked down the porch steps and stood between them, not blocking Gabriel's line of sight exactly, but claiming the space between them in a way that made the triangle of the three of them deliberate. "He's working for me this week," she said. "He's good with a brush axe." Gabriel said nothing. She looked up at him on the horse. "You've been paying for his clothes," she said. It wasn't a question, moved in Gabriel's jaw. "That's a generous thing," she said. "The boy needs it, and you did it without being asked." She let that sit for one moment, then she said, "But you give him coin and you hand him cold indifference. Don't force a 12-year-old boy to carry the sins of the past. That isn't kindness. It's quiet cruelty." Gabriel looked at her. His eyes were dark, and she could see things moving in them, things that had been shut up for a long time and didn't come to the surface easily. She held his gaze and didn't look away. "With respect, Miss Vance," he said quietly, "you don't know what you're talking about." "I know what I see," she said, "a boy standing up because he thinks he needs to be ready for trouble. That doesn't come from nowhere." He was quiet for a long moment. Thad hadn't moved. He was standing with his arms at his sides, and his eyes somewhere on the middle distance, the practiced stillness of someone who's learned to take up as little space as possible. Gabriel looked at him. Really looked. For what Eudora suspected was the first time in a long time. It was a hard thing to watch. Gabriel's face did something complicated that she didn't have a name for pain, she thought. But not only pain. Guilt, maybe, the specific weight of a guilt that had been carried so long it had changed shape. He looked away. Back at Eudora. "The post," he said. "I'll check it myself." And he turned the horse and went back toward the north boundary, his left leg carrying that permanent hitch in the saddle that she'd noticed the first day. She watched him go. Then she turned back to Thad. The boy was looking at the ground now. His jaw was set. "He hates me," Thad said. It came out flat, practiced. Like a fact he'd stated enough times that the hurt in it had been worn smooth. He doesn't, Eudora said. If he hated you, he wouldn't spend a dime on your clothes. She sat back down on the step. He's in pain, and you're standing close to it. That's different. Thad said nothing. That doesn't make it your fault, she said, and it doesn't make it fair. Those are two different things. He looked up at her. There was something careful and raw in his face at the same time. The expression of a boy who wanted to believe something, but had been disappointed by believing too many times, and hadn't quite worked out where to put the wanting. My father wasn't drunk, he said. I heard you the first time, she said. I believed you the first time. He sat back down. He picked up his lunch bowl. He didn't say anything else for a while, but the set of his shoulders was different, slightly less armor in it. She let the quiet be quiet. After a while he asked, What's that plant in the small pot by the door? Feverfew, she said. It's good for headaches. Also helps with fever, which is where the name comes from. Does it work? Better than most people expect, she said. He looked at it for a moment. How do you know all that? My grandmother taught me. Then I learned more on my own. She paused. Every plant out here has a use. Most of them have several. You just have to know what you're looking at. He looked out at the scrubland with fresh consideration, like she'd just told him there was a library in the desert, and he hadn't known where the door was. She paid him 10 cents when he left at mid-afternoon. He took it with a nod that was trying to be indifferent again, and she let him have that. Same time Thursday? She said. He looked at her. If you need the work done? I need it done, she said. He nodded. Then he went, picking his way back through the scrub toward whatever around meant for a boy with no fixed home in Ridgefield Valley. She watched him until the scrub closed over his path, and then she stood on her porch for a long moment in the afternoon heat. Gabriel Ryder had looked at that boy for one honest moment, and then looked away. She understood why. She wasn't unmoved by the grief that had built that 10-year wall around him, but understanding something and accepting its consequences were not the same action. The boy was 12 years old. He was carrying a dead man's reputation on his back, a reputation that the valley had decided was true because it was easier than looking for another answer. He was eating meals he could only access by sneaking, and healing bruises given to him because of a name he hadn't chosen. And somewhere in this valley, she suspected the real story of what happened at the wash 10 years ago was still waiting to be told. She was an herbal physician from Ohio with $12, a dry well, a newly acquired bull, and 30 acres of clay soil. But she was also a woman who had looked at an entire roomful of people, dismissing a bleeding man, and said something out loud about it, and she was not in the habit of stopping there. She went inside. She started making notes. He arrived on a Wednesday morning with a carriage. Not a wagon, a carriage. Black lacquered wood with brass fittings, pulled by a matched pair of gray horses with their manes braided. A driver, in a clean shirt, sat up top. The whole arrangement came up the Cedar Creek path like it belonged there, which it absolutely did not. Eudora was on her roof. She'd finally gotten the shingles she needed from the dry goods store, paid for, with $2 of the bull's assessed value, which the store owner had been willing to credit against future trade. And she'd been up there since sunrise, with a hammer and a bag of square-cut nails, working her way across the 2 soft spots she'd mapped on her first night in the cabin. It was hot work. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and there was sawdust in her hair, and she had a nail held between her teeth when the carriage came around the bend. She took the nail out of her mouth and looked down. The man who stepped out of the carriage was dressed better than anyone she'd seen in Ridgefield Valley. Better than anyone she'd seen in Columbus, Ohio, for that matter. A charcoal suit with a cream-colored vest. A black hat with a flat brim that had been blocked and brushed recently. Boots that had never seen a fence line. He was 45 or so, with silver at his temples, and a face that was handsome in the deliberate way of a man who'd had money long enough to take good care of himself. He looked up at her on the roof. She looked down at him with the hammer in her hand. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was warm and projected well, a voice accustomed to filling rooms. "I'm Harrison Montgomery. I hope I'm not interrupting." "You are," she said pleasantly, "but since you've already interrupted, you may as well say what you came to say." Something crossed his face, amusement, maybe, or the performance of it. He smiled. "I'll wait for you to come down." She drove 3 more nails before she came down. She descended the ladder with her hammer in her hand and her apron still on, and she did not apologize for either. She pulled the water dipper from the bucket on the porch railing and drank from it, and then looked at Harrison Montgomery across the yard. "What can I do for you, Mr. Montgomery?" she said. He looked around at Cedar Creek with the measured expression of a man pricing things. The cabin, the cleared south quarter, the herb bed she'd restarted after the bull incident, the fence posts on the north boundary. She watched him look at all of it, and was careful to watch his eyes and not the polished surface of his smile. "I'll be direct," he said. "Please," she said. "I'd like to buy your land." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "I'm prepared to offer you triple its assessed value, $300 for the 30 acres, the cabin, and any improvements." He held it out. "That's a generous sum for dry land, Miss Vance. You'd be comfortable for several years on that figure." She didn't take the document. "Cedar Creek isn't for sale," she said. His smile stayed in place. "You haven't heard the full offer." "The price doesn't change the answer," she said. "This is my land. I came here to work it, and I intend to work it." He was quiet for a moment. He folded the document and put it back in his coat. The smile was still there, but something underneath it had gone still. "I also came," he said, and his voice shifted into a register that was carefully calibrated, warm but significant, the voice of a man about to offer something he expected to land heavily, "to ask if you might consider a different arrangement altogether." He paused. "I'm a widower, Miss Vance. I have a large house and a substantial operation. You're an intelligent woman, clearly capable and new to this territory. A marriage to me would give you security, standing, and resources that no 30-acre homestead ever could." She looked at him. It had been a while since a man had proposed to her for reasons that had nothing to do with her as a person and everything to do with what she represented as a variable in his calculations. It had been about 8 months, in fact, in a parlor in Columbus, Ohio. The feeling was familiar. The answer was the same. "No," she said. He looked at her. He blinked once, which was probably as close to surprise as he allowed himself in company. "I beg your pardon?" "No," she said again. "Thank you for coming by, Mr. Montgomery. I have a roof to finish." She turned toward the ladder. He said, "Miss Vance." His voice was different now. The warmth was gone. What was left was precise and quiet, and something about it made her stop without quite meaning to. She turned back. He had reached into a different pocket of his coat. What he produced this time was not a real estate document. It was a single folded paper, older than the first, with a different weight to it. He unfolded it and held it where she could see it without being able to read it clearly, which was deliberate. "I had business interests in Ohio for some years," he said. "I'm acquainted with several lending institutions in Columbus." He looked at the paper. "Your father's name is Everett Vance." Her hand tightened on the hammer. "He had some financial difficulties," Montgomery said. "A promissory note for $1,000, signed in 1879, held by a lender named Carver and Sons. The note matured last March." He looked up at her. "Mr. Carver sold that note to me in June, which means your father's debt is now mine to collect." She looked at the paper, at the figure written on it. $1,000. She knew about her father's debt in the same way she knew about weather in Ohio, background fact of her life that she hadn't been responsible for creating and hadn't been able to do much about. She hadn't known Carver had sold it. She hadn't known it had found its way here. "The debt is my father's," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "Not mine." "In a legal sense, you're correct," Montgomery said. "A debt contracted before your majority by a male head of household does not technically attach to an unmarried daughter." He refolded the paper, put it back in his pocket. However, your father is 62 years old and in poor health and owns no real property. The only collectible asset is this deed. He looked at Cedar Creek, the cabin, the cleared south quarter, the restarted herb bed, which you inherited from a family member, making it, in certain legal arguments, a family asset. She understood what he was doing. She understood it completely. It was elegant in the way that traps were sometimes elegant. The mechanism was clean. The result was not. You're saying, she said slowly, that if I don't marry you, you'll use my father's debt to foreclose on my land. I'm saying, he said, carefully, that the note comes due in September. That gives you approximately 6 weeks. He picked up his hat, which he'd been holding, and set it back on his head. Marry me, Miss Vance, and the note disappears. The land stays yours under our combined name. You'd want for nothing. He was watching her. Looking for the moment, she calculated the odds and found them impossible. She stood in the yard of Cedar Creek with sawdust in her hair and a hammer in her hand and looked back at him. She was calculating. She was absolutely calculating. But she was calculating something different than he expected. I'll need to think on it, she said. His smile came back satisfied, sure of itself. Of course. Take the week. I'll need longer than a week, she said. The smile held. He nodded. He walked back to his carriage, and the driver clicked the horses forward, and the black lacquered carriage went back down the Cedar Creek path the way it had come. She stood in the yard until it was gone. Then she sat down on the porch steps. $1,000. 6 weeks. September. She was a woman alone on 30 dry acres with a bull, a medicine chest, a restarted herb garden, and $12 minus 2 that had gone to shingles. She sat with the math for a while. It was not encouraging math. Then she thought about the note in his pocket, about a man in a carriage with brass fittings who had deliberately purchased her father's debt from a lender in Ohio and carried it 2,000 miles to Arizona territory and used it as the second prong of a land proposal. Not the first, the second only, after she'd refused the simple buy. He had come prepared for both outcomes. That told her something important. He had known she would refuse to sell, which meant he'd known something about her before he arrived, or known something about Cedar Creek that made the land worth the preparation. She thought about Moira's voice when she'd said Montgomery's name on her first night. Keep your deed somewhere safe. She thought about the dry well, about what Moira had said. Whatever was feeding that land dried up, and nobody knows where it went. She thought about water. 30 acres of land that had gone dry 2 years ago, suddenly worth triple its assessed value to the wealthiest man in the valley. Worth enough that he'd bought a $1,000 debt in Ohio and carried it here as a contingency. Water was expensive in Arizona territory. Underground water was worth more than gold. She went inside and got her notebook and started writing everything down. Every fact in the order she'd learned it. She wrote until the light got bad, and then she lit the lamp and kept writing. The roof could wait until tomorrow. The Larkspur outbreak started on a Friday. Eudora knew Larkspur. She'd read about it extensively in her grandmother's herb manual, which devoted 4 full pages to toxic range plants with the specific note, where cattle graze freely, Larkspur kills quietly and quickly. The alkaloids disrupt the nervous system within hours. By the time symptoms show, the animal is often past saving. She spotted it first at the south edge of her property, where the scrub gave way to a rocky gulch. The tall purple flower spikes were distinctive, beautiful actually, in the way that many poisonous things were beautiful growing in a dense stand that the recent wind had apparently spread seed from. She'd pulled up what she could find on her own land and burned it immediately, but it had spread further than her property line. Gabriel Ryder found out at dawn Saturday when 3 of his broken wheel cattle were down in the south pasture, legs stiff, breathing labored. He rode to Cedar Creek at a hard gallop, pulled up at her door, and knocked once. She was already dressed. She'd seen the spreading larkspur stand the night before, and had been up since 4 thinking about it. She opened the door with her medicine chest, already packed differently: charcoal powder, vegetable oil, a length of rubber tubing she used for drenching, and every clean cloth she owned. She'd spent the dark hours preparing what she needed. "How many down?" she said. 3 confirmed. Possibly more by now. His face was tight. "What do you know about larkspur?" "Enough," she said. "The treatment is a drench-activated charcoal suspended in oil, administered directly to the stomach to bind the alkaloids before they finish absorbing. It only works in the early stages." She picked up the chest. "Take me there now." He looked at the chest, then at her. He didn't waste time on doubt. They went. The storm came without much warning, which was its custom in Arizona territory. By the time they reached the south pasture where the cattle were down, the sky to the west had gone the color of a bruise, and the wind had picked up in the way that meant business. Not rain. Not yet. Possibly not at all. A dust storm. A real one. She'd heard about them from Moira. She hadn't experienced one yet. Within 20 minutes of starting to work on the first downed animal, the light went orange and strange, and the wind hit like a wall. The dust was extraordinary. It was like being inside a cloud made of the ground itself. She tied her bandana over her nose and mouth and kept working, because the cattle were down now, and the storm was here, and neither of those facts changed the treatment. Gabriel worked beside her, holding animals steady, following her directions without argument or wasted motion. He was precise. When she said hold, he held. When she said move, he moved. They lost one of the 3. The other 2, with the charcoal drench administered in time, began stabilizing within the hour. By the time the storm had pushed through to the east, 2 more animals had been found early stage and treated. Gabriel's hands were black with charcoal, and his face was so coated in red dust that she could only clearly read his eyes. She was in the same condition. He looked around at the south pasture. 7 animals total, grazing or resting. 1 they'd lost, buried already at the edge of the field by 2 of his hands who'd ridden out into the tail end of the storm to help. He looked at the remaining 7. "That's because of what you brought," he said. It wasn't easy for him to say. She could tell he'd made it into a plain statement, specifically to avoid it being something more. "It's because we worked fast," she said, "and because your men found the others early." She stripped off her gloves. "The stand of larkspur runs along the gulch on the south boundary, both sides of my property line and yours. It needs to be pulled and burned before the seed spreads further. I'll start on the side Monday. I'll have men on mine," he said. The line shack was at the north edge of the south pasture, a single-room structure built for exactly these situations, when a storm or a crisis kept the hands too far from the main ranch to make it back. It wasn't much. A rough table, 2 chairs, a fireplace, a pair of blanket rolls on a low platform. They went in, out of the wind. She put her medicine chest on the table and went through it methodically, cataloging what she'd used and what she'd need to replace. He built a fire. There was wood stacked ready, and found a kettle and a tin of coffee on the shelf above the fireplace. Neither of them spoke for a while. The storm hammered at the walls, and the fire settled into a steady burn, and the coffee came up, and they sat on opposite sides of the rough table with their cups and the storm noise around them. She looked at his left leg. He was sitting with it extended slightly, the way a person sits when bending a joint hurts. She'd noticed he favored it consistently, not just the drag when he walked, but the way he positioned himself when standing still, always taking weight off the left. "The leg," she said. Not a question. She wasn't asking whether it hurt. She was opening a door. He looked at her. "What happened?" she said. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at the fire for a long moment. "Flash flood," he said. 10 years ago, down in the wash south of town." He paused. "It came fast. Too fast. There was a wagon ahead of us Jonah met with his daughter, and my wife was with them." Another pause. "I was riding behind. When the water came down the canyon, I went in after the wagon." He stopped. She waited. The current was. He stopped again. My leg caught between two boulders on the way in, shattered the bone below the knee. By the time I got free, the wagon was gone. He looked at his hands. I couldn't pull her out. I couldn't reach her. My leg was. He stopped a third time and didn't start again. The fire popped. She sat with what he'd said and didn't rush to fill the silence. Lydia, he said, after a while. The name came out quietly, like something kept in a careful place and didn't take out often. Her name was Lydia. Tell me about her, Eudora said. He looked up. That surprised him. Most people, she'd found, asked about the accident, about the flood, about the facts of the catastrophe. Nobody asked about the person. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, she laughed at things other people didn't notice. Small things. A dog's expression. The way a particular cloud looked. She had opinions about coffee. She thought it should always be strong enough to be taken seriously. He almost smiled. Then he didn't. She would have liked you. I think I would have liked her, Eudora said. He looked at his cup. She leaned forward slightly on the table. Gabriel. She'd used his name twice before. He'd never corrected her. What happened to you in that flood wasn't a failure. It was a catastrophe. Those are different things. A failure is a choice that went wrong. A catastrophe is a force that was larger than any one person. He said nothing. You weren't guilty for surviving, she said. Those who leave us, they want us to live, not to bury ourselves alongside them. He looked at her. His eyes were dark in the firelight, and there was something raw in them. Something that had been under 10 years of silence and was having trouble with the open air. He stopped. That's a generous interpretation. It's the correct one, she said. Guilt has its uses. It tells us when we've genuinely done wrong and gives us the direction to make it right. But guilt for surviving a flood that broke your leg and took your wife before you could reach her. That isn't conscience, Gabriel. That's punishment. And you've been punishing yourself for a decade for something that was never yours to answer for. He looked at the fire. She picked up her coffee cup and sat back and let him have the silence. Outside, the storm was dying. The hammering against the walls had eased to a steady low moan. The fire had settled. The line shack was warm, and the dark outside the single window was the particular dark that came. After a storm passed clean and deep and very still, she said more quietly. The boy has the same posture you do. Did you know that? He looked at her. Thad, she said. He stands like he's always ready for something bad. Like he's been waiting so long for it that he doesn't know how to stand any other way. She looked at her cup. You have more in common with him than you want to. Gabriel said nothing. But he didn't look away. A man who's been through real loss knows what it costs, she said. Which means he also knows what it costs a 12-year-old boy to carry one. She paused. I'm not asking you to stop grieving. I'm asking you to stop making the boy feel like he's the grave. The fire popped again. Gabriel looked at the window, at the dark outside. Then he said, I'll think on it, which was, she was learning, as close to a promise as Gabriel Ryder made. She was going to say something else, she wasn't sure what, when she saw the glow through the window. It was in the wrong direction to be dawn. Too orange, too red, too low on the horizon. She stood up. Gabriel was already standing, the leg forgotten for the moment, and they both moved to the window and then to the door, and when he pulled it open, the night air came in, smelling of smoke, and the glow to the south was unmistakable. Cedar Creek was on fire. She ran. He kept up she'd forgotten what his leg cost him. Or maybe he had, and they covered the ground between the line shack and Cedar Creek in a dead run, and the fire grew in front of them as they ran, growing from a glow to a roar, from a roar to a wall of orange-red light that lit the canyon walls and turned the night sky above the cabin a terrible bright amber. The cabin was fully engaged. All four walls, the roof, the porch, with the water buckets she'd left there that morning. All of it. She stopped at the edge of the cleared ground because the heat was immediate and enormous, and the fire didn't care about anything. Then she heard it, a voice, small, coming from inside. Thad. She didn't know why he was there. She didn't stop to figure it out. She just opened her mouth to scream his name, and Gabriel Ryder was already moving past her before she got the sound out. He went straight at the door. The door was on fire. He hit it with his shoulder, and it gave inward, and the heat and smoke came out like a fist, and she saw him go in, and she had never in her life wanted so badly to follow a person somewhere, and known so certainly that she could not. She stood at the edge of the heat and counted. 10 seconds. 20. Then Gabriel came out of the burning door with Thad over his shoulder, moving fast, one arm around the boy, and one hand on what was left of the doorframe, and they hit the yard dirt 10 feet from the cabin, and she was already running toward them. She reached them and dropped to her knees, and Gabriel was already turning the boy face up, checking him smoke inhalation, she was thinking, and burns, and the crack of the rifle was sharp and clear and completely wrong against the sound of the fire. Gabriel made a sound that wasn't a word. He went down, not backward, sideways like something fundamental had been removed. He hit the ground beside that, and she saw the dark bloom spreading across his left chest, and she pressed her hands to it without thinking, and the fire roared behind them, and the embers came down like terrible orange snow, and the blood ran through. Her fingers and Gabriel Ryder looked up at the sky, with eyes that were still open, and she pressed harder and said his name. The canyon walls threw the echo of the shot back and forth between them in the dark. Then it was just the fire, and her hands, and his blood, and the boy coughing beside them in the dirt. And somewhere in the dark tree line across the clearing, silence. She didn't think about being afraid. There wasn't room for it. Fear takes up space, and everything in her right now was occupied by the problem in front of her, which was a man bleeding into the Arizona dirt with a rifle bullet somewhere in his chest, and the nearest physician 40 miles east in Tucson. Thad, she said. Loud, clear. Can you hear me? The boy coughed, rolled onto his side, coughed again. Yes. Good. Listen carefully. I need you to run to the broken wheel and bring back every man who's awake. Tell them Gabriel Ryder is shot and we need a wagon. Tell them to bring lanterns. Can you do that? He was already getting up. Go fast, she said. But don't fall. He went. She pressed both hands harder against Gabriel's chest and looked at his face. His eyes were open and tracking, which was the best possible sign. Conscious meant the bullet hadn't hit anything immediately catastrophic. Chest wounds were treacherous. They could look survivable and not be, or look terrible and be manageable. And she needed better light and a flat surface to know which this was. Stay with me, she said to him. Not going anywhere, he said. His voice was rough and strained, but present. Does anything else hurt? Arms, legs. Just, he stopped for a breath. Just the one place. That's good. That's a good sign. I need you to keep your breathing shallow if you can. Don't try to take deep breaths. He did what she said. She could feel his effort in it. Behind them, her cabin was still burning. She didn't look at it. The fire was its own catastrophe, and it would finish what it was doing, with or without her attention. And Gabriel Ryder was not finishing anything tonight if she had anything to say about it. The broken wheel hands arrived in 18 minutes. She knew because she counted, not from anxiety, but because timing mattered medically, and she'd learned years ago to track it automatically. 4 men on horseback and a flat wagon, Thad on the seat next to the driver, 2 lanterns swinging. They moved Gabriel onto the wagon carefully, on her direction. She controlled the movement of his torso throughout, keeping the wound site stable, and she climbed in beside him and held pressure the entire ride to Moira Sterling's boarding house, which was the closest building with a proper table and good lamplight. Moira had the door open before the wagon stopped. She took one look at Gabriel in the wagon bed and at Eudora's blood-soaked hands and went directly inside without a word. By the time they carried Gabriel through the door, Moira had the big dining table cleared, 4 oil lamps burning at full wick, and a pot of water already heating on the stove. 60 years old and moving like a woman 20 years younger when it mattered. Eudora got Gabriel onto the table. She looked at the hands around her 4 ranch hands. Moira. Thad, standing in the doorway, still smelling of smoke. Everyone who isn't holding a lamp, step back, she said. Moira, stay close. Come here. Thad came. You're going to hold this cloth exactly here, she showed him, guiding his hands to the pressure point on Gabriel's chest. Press down firmly. Don't move your hands no matter what you hear or see. Can you do that? He looked at Gabriel's face. Then at Eudora. Yes. Good. She went to work. She washed her hands first always, first, no matter the urgency. Because dirty hands in an open wound killed more patients than the wound itself. She'd learned that at her grandmother's knee and had the principle reinforced every time she read about the work coming out of European medical circles on infection and surgical cleanliness. Clean hands, clean instruments. That was the foundation. She laid out what she had from her medicine chest, the curved probe she used for wound exploration, her surgical scissors, silk thread and curved needles, the carbolic solution, the whiskey for cleaning the field, a small pair of forceps that she kept sharp and had used for thorns and embedded gravel, but had never used for something like this. She had done difficult work before. She had stitched bad tears and set broken fingers and drained infected wounds and talked people through fevers that should have killed them. She had never extracted a bullet. She knew the principles. She'd read surgical texts she borrowed from a physician in Columbus who'd found her competence more impressive than her gender and had lent her his library over 3 years. She knew that the goal was to locate the projectile without disturbing major vessels, remove it cleanly, and close in layers to prevent the deep infection that would finish what the bullet started. Knowing it and doing it were separated by a distance she was going to cross tonight, regardless. This is going to hurt him considerably, she said to Moira. I need him still. Moira looked at 2 of the ranch hands. They came forward and took hold of Gabriel's shoulders. She gave Gabriel a measured dose of laudanum, the only thing she had for pain at this level, dissolved in water, and waited 8 minutes for it to take partial hold. Not enough to knock him out. Enough to dull the edge, Gabriel, she said. His eyes found hers. I'm going to get it out, she said. It's going to hurt. I need you to breathe shallow and hold still. Your men have your shoulders. Trust them. I trust. He stopped for a breath. I trust you. She picked up the probe and went in. It took 22 minutes. She knew because Moira counted quietly at the lamp, marking time in 5-minute intervals at Eudora's request. Time mattered. Exposure time in an open cavity increased infection risk, and she wanted to know exactly how long she'd been working at every moment. The bullet had entered below the left clavicle and traveled at a downward angle, which was consistent with a shot from higher ground. The tree line across the clearing was on a rise above Cedar Creek. It had missed the subclavian artery by a margin she didn't want to calculate. It had clipped the edge of the second rib and come to rest against the interior surface of that rib, which was why it hadn't gone deeper. The rib had stopped it. The rib had saved his life. She got the forceps around it on the 3rd attempt, and it came out clean. She held it up in the lamplight, a .44 caliber round, flattened slightly on the nose from the rib impact. Moira looked at it, then at Eudora. Gabriel was breathing, shallow, pained, present. She cleaned the wound cavity with carbolic solution. Gabriel made a sound through his teeth that she acknowledged with a hand on his arm for exactly 2 seconds, and then went back to work and closed in. 3 layers, the way the surgical texts described it. Deep tissue first, then the muscle layer, then the skin. 15 sutures on the exterior, even, close, and tight. She tied off the last one and stepped back. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this with a kind of distant interest, the way you notice something from a window. They'd been completely steady throughout. Now that the work was finished, her body had opinions about what had just happened. She set down her instruments. She pressed both hands flat on the table edge and breathed. Moira put a cup of coffee in her hands without being asked. strong and hot. Eudora wrapped both palms around it and drank half of it, standing up. Thad was still in the corner. He'd been there the whole time, very quiet, very still. Not the frozen stillness of shock, but the deliberate stillness of a boy who understood that being useful sometimes meant staying out of the way. His eyes were on Gabriel. "He's going to be all right," she said to him. He looked at her. "You're sure?" "I'm sure enough," she said. "The next 3 days will tell us more. But the bullet is out, the bleeding is stopped, and his breathing is even." She paused. "He's strong. That helps." Thad looked at Gabriel's face. Gabriel had drifted into a pain-heavy sleep. The laudanum had finally done its full work. His face was pale and drawn but breathing, and the chest bandage was clean. "He went in after me," Thad said. "The cabin was—" He stopped. "I know," Eudora said. "He didn't have to." "No," she said, "he didn't." Thad looked at the floor. There was something working through him that was too large and too new to have a name yet. She didn't push it. She sent the ranch hands back to the broken wheel with instructions for Gabriel's care schedule and a list of what she'd need brought back in the morning. She asked one of them to ride to Tucson for the doctor, not because she doubted her own work, but because a physician's follow-up examination in 48 hours was simply good medicine, and she wasn't too proud to know the difference between what she could do and what a fully trained surgeon could confirm. Moira set up the back room for Gabriel, the best room, with the widest bed and the window that caught the morning air. Thad slept on a cot in the hall. Eudora didn't sleep at all. She sat in the chair beside Gabriel's bed and monitored his breathing at regular intervals, and changed the cold cloth on his forehead when it warmed, and thought about a .44 caliber bullet and a tree line above Cedar Creek and the particular angle of a shot fired from elevated ground. She thought about Harrison Montgomery and his carriage with the brass fittings. She thought about what she needed to prove. At first light, she left Gabriel in Moira's care and went back to Cedar Creek. The cabin had burned to the foundation. The walls were gone. The roof was ash. The fireplace stood in the middle of the ruins like a chimney above a sunken ship. The stone, black with soot but intact stone, didn't burn, which was one thing you could say for it. Everything else was rubble and char. She picked her way through it carefully. Her medicine chest had been under the bed. The bed was gone, but the chest was iron-banded leather and had survived with surface scorching. She pulled it out. The contents were intact. She held it against her chest for a moment. Not from sentiment, though there was some of that, but because without that chest, she was considerably less useful to anyone. Thad arrived while she was still in the ruins. He'd come from Moira's, moving fast. She looked up at him. "You're supposed to be resting." "I'm fine," he said. He looked around at the burned cabin. He'd been inside it last night. She could see him putting that together, where he'd been standing, where the walls had been. "Why were you here last night?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I sleep here sometimes." "In the lean-to." He said it without embarrassment, but also without much expectation that she'd receive it neutrally. "It's dry, and nobody bothers me." She nodded. She wasn't going to make anything of it right now, except a mental note that the lean-to needed to be rebuilt as part of the first priority construction. He started picking through the rubble on the south side while she worked the north, and about an hour in, on the east wall near what had been the corner of the room, he stopped. "Miss Vance." She came over. He was crouched over something in the ash. He'd found it with his hands, not his eyes digging through the debris and hitting something solid that wasn't stone. He brushed the ash away carefully. It was an iron cap, a branding cap, the kind fitted over the end of a fire iron and used to press a ranch mark. The handle had burned away. It had been wood, but the iron head was intact, melted slightly on the edges from the heat, but legible. The mark pressed into it was a connected H&M Harrison Montgomery's brand. She crouched beside Thad and looked at it without touching it. "You know whose that is," Thad said. "I do," she said. He looked at her. He was 12 years old, and he'd nearly burned to death in a fire, set by a man who owned half the valley, and his face was very calm and very serious, in the way of a boy who'd been dealing with serious things without backup for most of his life. "What are we going to do about it?" he said. She picked up the branding cap, with a cloth to preserve it, turned it in her hands. The mark was clear even through the soot. "We're going to find out everything," she said. "And then we're going to be able to prove it." She held the iron cap and looked at the burned foundation of what had been her home and thought about water, about a dry well, about why 30 dry acres were worth $1,000 note carried 2,000 miles from Ohio, about a flood 10 years ago that had killed 2 people, about the timeline she'd been building in her notebook, the notebook that had also burned, but the contents of which were stored in the part of her mind that didn't lose things. She started talking through it out loud, because talking through it helped, and Thad was listening with the focused attention of a boy who understood that being trusted with real information was not a small thing. "He controls most of the water rights in this valley," she said, "but not all. There's an underground aquifer under Cedar Creek. I don't know it for certain yet, but it's the only explanation for why dry land is worth triple its value to him. If that aquifer connects the 2 valleys, whoever controls Cedar Creek controls water that Montgomery can't get any other way." She looked at the burned foundation. "He tried to buy it. When that didn't work, he used the debt as leverage. When I didn't fold immediately, he burned the cabin to drive me out. Or to kill me. Possibly both." Thad was quiet for a moment. "And the flood," he said. She looked at him. "My father's flood," he said. His voice was steady. "Is that connected?" She looked at the branding cap in her hands, at the valley spreading out beyond the ruins, at the mountains to the north where the canyon ran deep. "I think it might be," she said, "and I think I know where to start looking." The canyon above Montgomery's property was 3 miles of hard going. It wasn't a trail people used. It had been a trail once, evidenced by the old stone cairns spaced along the east ridge, but brush had reclaimed most of it, and the last mile was pure scramble over loose rock and mesquite. Eudora wore her heaviest boots and brought a canvas pack with water, her notebook a replacement she'd bought from Moira's small store of supplies, a hand trowel, and a geologist's pick she'd borrowed from the dry goods owner, who'd had it in a back shelf for 15 years and couldn't immediately remember where it had come from. Thad came with her. She hadn't told him not to. He knew this canyon better than she did. He'd been ranging around the valley's edges for years, alone, finding the places where nobody went because nobody went there. And that knowledge was worth more than an argument about whether a 12-year-old should be climbing canyon walls. Gabriel was alive and stable. The Tucson doctor had arrived on Monday afternoon, examined Eudora's work with the careful attention of a professional assessing another professional's output, and said, with minimal elaboration, that the extraction was clean and the closure was well done. Gabriel had a fever of 101 that the doctor expected to break within 2 days. He was to stay in bed for 3 weeks and was not to be argued with about this. The last instruction was clearly aimed at Gabriel rather than Eudora, because Gabriel had already attempted to get up twice and had been stopped once by Moira and once by the combined social pressure of 4 of his own ranch hands standing in the doorway looking at him. Eudora had sat on the edge of his bed the morning before she and Thad left for the canyon and looked at him directly. 3 weeks, she said. 2, he said. 3, she said. Or I'll tell Moira to hide your boots. He looked at her. There was something in his face that wasn't entirely fever, a warmth in it that had nothing to do with his temperature and everything to do with the particular way she met his eyes without looking away. He'd noticed she did that. She never looked away first. 3 weeks, he said. Thank you, she said. She left before either of them could say anything else about the way that conversation had felt. The canyon was beautiful in the harsh way that Arizona territory was often. Beautiful sheer red walls going up 200 feet on both sides. The morning light coming in at a low angle that turned everything gold and amber. Scrub oak clung to the ledges. A hawk was working the thermals overhead. The collapsed dam was another half-mile past the point where the trail gave out entirely. Thad found it. She'd described what she was looking for evidence of a man-made water structure, probably stone and timber, in a location that would have controlled flow into the wash below. And he'd taken that description and walked for 20 minutes, and then said, simply, "Here." She came up beside him and stopped. It was substantial, even collapsed. The stone and timber remained stretched across the narrowest point of the canyon, maybe 40 feet across where the canyon walls angled inward, and created a natural choke point. The timber was long gone, rotted or washed away, but the stone remained. Large flat slabs and fitted river rock, the kind of construction that required significant labor and planning. Brush had grown up through the rubble over 10 years, the root systems cracking and spreading what was left. But the original shape was legible. A dam, at least 12 feet high at its tallest point, based on the debris spread below. She walked the length of the collapse from west to east, measuring with her pace and mapping it in her notebook. She looked at the stone construction. Fitted, not just piled. Samion had built this with intention and some knowledge of masonry. It was also unengineered in the critical sense. No overflow channel, no controlled spillway, nothing to manage an excess of water if rainfall exceeded the dam's capacity. In a canyon like this, a single significant rain event hitting the rim would generate a wall of water that had nowhere to go but through, or over, or through the entire structure, if the structure couldn't hold. She started digging at the base of the rubble on the west side, where the debris was deepest. She used the trowel first, then the pick when she hit compacted material. Thad worked alongside her, his smaller hands useful in the tighter gaps between the fallen stone. An hour in, she found the first survey stake. It was iron, 18 inches long, driven into a crack in the bedrock, and covered by 10 years of accumulated debris. She cleared it and looked at the head of it. A flat cap stamped with initials H.M. Harrison Montgomery. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. Then she photographed it in her notebook, meaning she made a careful drawing with exact measurements, which was the field documentation available to her. "That's his," Thad said. "It is," she said. "This stake marks the western boundary of a structure built on his order, which means he commissioned this dam." She kept digging. The ledger took another 40 minutes to find, and she almost missed it entirely. It was tucked into a natural shelf in the canyon wall at the east end of the rubble. Samion had placed it there deliberately, at the edge of the construction, the way a freighter might record his work at a job site. It was wrapped in oilcloth, which had preserved it against the weather better than she had any right to expect. The oilcloth itself had cracked and blackened, but inside it the ledger was damaged, but legible water-stained on the edges, the last 10 pages fused together, but the core entries clear. It was a freight ledger. The name on the inside cover, written in a large, deliberate hand, Simyarnell, Freighter, Ridgefield Valley. She opened it carefully, turning the pages at the corners. It was a record of deliveries and work orders. Dates, materials, locations, payers. She turned to the last readable section and found the entries from 1,872 and 1,873. August 1,872, stone delivery, Upper Canyon, East Ridge, 12 loads. Payment received from H. Montgomery, Broken Wheel Ranch. September 1,872, timber delivery, same site. Payment H. Montgomery. November 1,872, masonry labor, sourced and contracted. 6 supervised by J. Pollard. Engineer from Tucson job, incomplete due to labor dispute. Balance of payment received from H. Montgomery. She read that entry twice. Engineer from Tucson job incomplete. The engineer had left before the spillway was built. The dam had been constructed. Without the safety infrastructure, the engineer would have required March 1873. Final site inspection conducted at request of H. Montgomery. Structure assessed as unsafe, no overflow management. Insufficient footing at west abutment. Written report delivered to Montgomery office. March 14, 1873. Advised immediate remediation or removal. Montgomery did not respond. She held the ledger in both hands and read that entry again slowly. Montgomery had been told in writing, in March of 1873, that the dam was unsafe. The flood that killed Lydia Ryder and Jonah Miller had been in October of 1873. 7 months. 7 months between a written warning that the dam would fail and the day it failed. Thad was reading over her shoulder. She hadn't tried to shield the ledger from him. He had a right to this. She heard him breathe in, then out. He knew, Thad said. His voice was flat. He knew the dam was unsafe, she said carefully. That's what this establishes. And when it failed. When it failed, it sent a wall of water down the canyon into the wash. She looked at the collapsed stone around them. Your father was driving through the wash that day. So was Lydia Ryder. When the dam broke, there was nothing they could have done. There was no time. There was no drunk driver. There was just a wall of water that shouldn't have existed. Thad was quiet. She looked at him. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were working hard at something. Your father didn't cause that flood, she said. A dam that was built illegally, without proper engineering, and allowed to stand for 7 months after its owner was told it was going to fail, that caused the flood. Jonah Miller was a sober man, trying to drive a wagon through a wash that was safe until it wasn't. And he died trying. The words landed. She watched them land. She watched them go through the 10 years of accumulated weight the boy had been carrying on his back since before he was old enough to understand what it meant, and she watched something in his face that had been set and braced and armored for a very long time shift. He sat down on a piece of fallen stone. She gave him the time he needed. A hawk called overhead. The canyon walls caught the sound and held it. After a while, Thad said, nobody knew this was up here. Sim Yarnell knew, she said. He wrote it down. She held up the ledger, and then he put it somewhere safe, in oilcloth, where it would last. I don't think that was an accident. She thought about Sim Yarnell. Moira had mentioned him once in passing. An old retired freighter, 81 years old, still living on the south edge of town. She'd filed the name away without knowing why. Now she knew why. She wrapped the ledger back in what remained of the oilcloth and placed it in her canvas pack, along with a careful sketch of the survey stake. She noted the stake's position and depth in her notebook. She noted the dimensions of the collapsed dam, the location of the HM stamp, the entry dates from the ledger. Then she stood and looked at the canyon around her, the collapsed stone, the old brush grown through the rubble, the way the canyon narrowed at exactly this point where the water would have been stopped and stored. This was where it had started. 10 years ago, water had built up behind these stones until the west abutment let go, and a wall of that water had gone down the canyon and into the wash below and taken 2 lives. And the man who'd been told it would happen had let it happen, and then directed the valley's grief and blame at a dead driver he could not contradict. It was a complete picture. She needed one more thing to make it usable. Not just evidence that the dam existed, Montgomery could argue. The ledger was wrong, the stake was misplaced, the survey incomplete. She needed a living witness, someone who could stand in front of people and say what they knew. She needed Sim Yarnell. She shouldered her pack. Can you walk back down faster than we came up? Thad stood. He had the self-contained expression he usually wore, but there was something different underneath it. Lighter, like a door in him had opened into a room that had more air in it than the one he'd been living in. Yes, he said. They went back down the canyon in just under an hour, faster on the descent, the morning light following them out of the rock walls into the open valley below. She was already planning what came next. She had the branding cap from the fire. She had the survey stake and a precise field sketch of it. She had the ledger entries in Yarnell's own hand. She had the physical remains of an illegal dam in a canyon above Montgomery's property. She had a timeline that put Montgomery's knowledge of the danger 7 months before the flood that had killed 2 people and broken Gabriel Ryder's leg and left a 12-year-old boy to carry a false name for a decade. What she needed now was a room, a witness, and the right moment, and she needed Gabriel Ryder on his feet. She walked back toward Ridgefield Valley with Thad beside her and the ledger in her pack, and for the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach into the red dust of this place, she felt the specific clarity that came when evidence aligned, when the facts pointed in one direction, and that direction was true. The frontier was vast, and the law was slow, and Harrison Montgomery had money and influence and 45 years of unchallenged certainty. But he'd left his brand on a fire iron in the ashes of her cabin. He'd let his initials be stamped into an iron survey stake, driven into bedrock. He'd paid a freighter to deliver stone and timber, and failed to respond to a written warning. And the freighter had written all of it down, and wrapped it in oilcloth, and set it on a shelf in a canyon where the world could find it whenever the world was ready. The world was ready now. The town meeting was Harrison Montgomery's idea. That was the first irony of it. He'd called it himself through the notice board at the general store, summoning the ranchers and cattlemen of Ridgefield Valley to witness the formal transfer of Cedar Creek land under a defaulted promissory note. He'd written the notice in confident language, a matter of property law and settled debt, and signed it with his full name because he was a man accustomed to his full name carrying weight. He expected Eudora Vance to either not show up or show up alone. He was wrong on both counts. The general store was the largest interior space in Ridgefield Valley outside of the church, and by 9 o'clock on Thursday morning, it was full. Ranchers, cattlemen, shopkeepers, the dry goods owner, the livery man, Moira Sterling, in the front row with her arms folded and her expression set like concrete. About 50 people total, standing where the shelves ended and the open floor began. The air smelled of sawdust and tobacco, and the particular tension that collects in a room when everyone present knows something significant is about to happen, and isn't certain which direction it will fall. Montgomery arrived at 9 sharp. He had 2 men with him, large, quiet men who stood slightly behind his shoulders. He was dressed as well as the first day he'd come to Cedar Creek. He looked at the room and saw his own influence reflected in it and appeared satisfied. He did not look at the door. Eudora came in with Thad beside her. She'd been up since 4. She had her evidence arranged in the canvas pack she'd been seen carrying, for 3 days itemized and ordered in the sequence she intended to present it. She wore her cleanest dress, the dark green wool she'd been saving for occasions that required presentation, and her hair was up properly, pinned with 2 bone combs. She looked like what she was, a woman who had come prepared to be taken seriously. Thad walked straight back beside her, which he'd been doing for 2 days now with increasing naturalness, like a posture he was growing back into. Montgomery looked at her and smiled. "Miss Vance, I'm glad you came. This won't take long." "No," she said. "It won't." She set her pack on the counter. Then the door opened again. Gabriel Ryder walked in. He was 3 days short of his 3-week recovery period, and she'd argued with him about it at 6 o'clock this morning and lost, which she accepted, because she'd known she was going to lose since the previous afternoon, when she'd seen his face settle into that particular stillness that meant the decision was made and further discussion was informational only. He was pale. The wound showed in the careful way he moved, protecting his left side, but he was standing. He was dressed clean shirt, his good hat, and he had something in his right hand and something in his left, and he walked through the crowd, which opened for him without being asked, and came to stand at the counter beside Eudora. He set both objects on the counter, in front of Montgomery, with a sound that carried across the suddenly very quiet room. The twisted iron survey stake landed first. Then the burned branding cap, the H, M mark, facing up. Montgomery looked at both objects. His expression didn't change. He was a man who'd practiced not letting his expression change in difficult moments. I don't know what those are supposed to, he started. Then let me explain them, Eudora said. She opened her pack. She took the room through it in the order she'd planned. The botanical documentation first. She explained the Larkspur outbreak, the spread pattern, the proximity to the canyon above Montgomery's property. She explained that she'd gone to the canyon to understand the valley's water history and what she'd found there. She laid the field sketch of the dam on the counter. She described its construction, its dimensions, its location, and its condition. She placed the branding cap beside the sketch. This was recovered from the ruins of my cabin. It is Montgomery's brand on an arsonist's tool. A sound moved through the room, low and unsettled. She placed the survey stake beside it. This stake was driven into bedrock at the western abutment of the dam. His initials are stamped on the head. He commissioned that dam. She placed Sim Yarnell's freight ledger, open to the relevant pages, flat on the counter, and is the record of how it was built and what happened afterward. She looked at the room, 50 faces looking back at her. She walked them through the ledger entries, the stone deliveries, the timber deliveries, the labor contracted and paid for by Harrison Montgomery, the engineer's assessment in March of 1,873, the written warning delivered to Montgomery's office, structure assessed as unsafe, no overflow management. The 7 months between that warning and October of 1,873. Jonah Miller was driving through the wash the day the dam failed, she said. Lydia Ryder was in that wagon with him. The flood that killed them was not an act of nature. It was the consequence of an illegal structure, built without proper engineering, left standing for 7 months after its owner received written notice that it was going to fail. The room was very still. Jonah Miller was sober, she said. He was doing exactly what any driver would do on that road on that day. Harrison Montgomery started the rumor that he was drunk because a dead drunk driver couldn't contradict it, and it redirected every question away from the canyon above. She stopped. Montgomery cleared his throat. This ledger is these. Entries could have been written by anyone. This stake could have been placed. Sim Yarnell is outside, Eudora said. Silence. He's 81 years old, and he's been carrying this since 1,873. He wrote the ledger. He put it on that shelf in the canyon because he knew what it meant, and he didn't know what to do about a man as powerful as Harrison Montgomery. She looked at the door. He's ready to say all of it in front of every person in this room. The door opened. 2 of Gabriel's ranch hands helped Sim Yarnell through it. He was very old and very thin and walked with a cane, but his eyes were clear and sharp, and when he got to the front of the room and saw the ledger open, on the counter he straightened his back and looked at Montgomery with the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time to stop carrying something. Montgomery looked at Yarnell, at the ledger, at the 2 objects on the counter, at the 50 faces in the room that were now looking at him with an attention that had changed its character completely. He opened his mouth. Gabriel moved. He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and took Montgomery by the collar of his fine charcoal suit and brought him down. Not violently, but with absolute certainty, to the level of a 12-year-old boy standing at the counter's edge. Montgomery was forced to look at that ad. Thad stood straight and looked back at him and said nothing, which was more powerful than anything he could have said. Gabriel's voice was quiet and carried to every corner of the room. You stole a dead man's honor, ruined a boy's childhood, and forced this whole valley to live a lie. He held Montgomery's eyes. Out here, the law might be slow, but a poor boy's dignity is worth more than every dirty acre you own. The room didn't cheer. It did something better than that. It went completely quiet with the specific quality of a group of people absorbing a truth and recognizing it, which is a heavier and more permanent sound than any celebration. Montgomery's two men didn't move. They looked at the 50 ranchers and cattlemen in that room and made the correct calculation. 3 of the valley ranchers stepped forward and took Montgomery by the arms. The county sheriff, who had been in the back of the room the whole time, which Eudora had arranged, specifically came forward with his handcuffs. The charges were arson, attempted murder, criminal negligence resulting in death, and fraud. The federal marshal had been sent for 2 days ago by wire. Montgomery was led out of the general store into the morning sun, and the room exhaled. Eudora looked at the counter, at the ledger and the stake and the burned branding cap, all in a row. She picked up the ledger and walked it over to Sim Yarnell, still standing with his cane by the door. "You kept this for 20 years, she said. He looked at it. Couldn't prove anything alone. Couldn't make anyone listen. He looked at her, needed someone who knew what to do with it. She pressed his hand. "You did the right thing. It just took time to land." He nodded slowly, the nod of a very old man who has learned that time is the only honest judge of most things. Gabriel came to stand beside her. She looked at his left side. "How's the chest?" "Manageable," he said. "That's not what I asked." "It hurts," he said. "But I'll live." "Yes," she said. "You will." The federal court moved faster than anyone expected, partly because the evidence was comprehensive, partly because 3 valley ranchers had witnessed the presentation and were willing to testify, and partly because Montgomery's financial records, subpoenaed by the federal marshal within a week of the arrest, revealed that the 1,000 promissory note against Everett Vance had been purchased through a third party specifically to use as leverage against his daughter, which added extortion to the list of charges and removed any remaining legal ambiguity about the note's validity. The court confiscated it along with Montgomery's other assets under review. A clerk rode out to Cedar Creek, what was left of it, on a Tuesday morning to deliver the papers to Eudora. The note, officially voided and returned to her possession. A single piece of paper that had traveled from Columbus, Ohio, to Ridgefield Valley, Arizona Territory, across 2,000 miles and one man's calculation that a woman alone could be frightened into surrender. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a long moment. Then she went to find Moira, read the situation immediately when Eudora arrived with the paper and a specific look on her face. She went out back without being asked and came back with a small clay fire pot, the kind she used in winter to heat the back porch. She set it in the center of the town square. It wasn't a formal arrangement. Nobody had announced anything, but news moved fast in Ridgefield Valley, and by the time the fire pot was lit, there were 30 people present in a loose and growing ring. Gabriel was there, his arm in a sling he was wearing under protest. Thad stood beside him. Sim Yarnell had come out on his porch across the street and was watching from his chair, which was close enough. Eudora stood at the fire pot and looked at the note, $1,000. Her father's signature at the bottom, the lender's seal above it. The date of origination, 1,879. The date it had passed to Montgomery, June, 1,883. The mechanism by which a man had tried to turn a woman's family obligation into a leash. She looked up at the people around her. "My father signed this note 4 years ago," she said. "He needed the money, and he borrowed it, and he couldn't pay it back. And that's a story as old as hard times." She looked at the paper again. "When I came to Arizona Territory, I left Ohio because I wasn't willing to be sold to pay a debt I didn't make. What I didn't know was that the debt followed me here." She paused. "What I know now is that I paid it. I paid it with 6 weeks of hauling water on a wooden sled in August heat. I paid it with a medicine chest and silk thread and a knowledge of plants that I spent 6 years learning. I paid it every time I stitched a wound that nobody else would touch, and every hour I spent on my knees in clay soil trying to grow something worth growing." She looked at the fire pot. "A woman doesn't need a man to buy her freedom," she said. "She needs her own 2 hands and the willingness to use them." She put the note in the fire. It caught quickly, old paper. dry as the valley, and burned clean. The ash rose in the wind, took it east, out over the scrubland, and was gone. The square was quiet for a moment. Then Moira made a sound that was not quite a word, but was entirely approving. A few people clapped. Someone at the back said something to their neighbor and laughed. Eudora watched the ash go. That afternoon, Gabriel rode out to the valley's east edge, to the small cemetery set in the shade of a stand of old juniper trees, where Lydia Ryder and Jonah Miller were both buried. Thad came with him. Neither of them had discussed it beforehand. Thad had simply been at the broken wheel when Gabriel saddled the horse, and Gabriel had looked at him and said, "You want to come?" And Thad had gotten his hat. They stood at both graves. Lydia's stone first, simple granite, her name and dates, and below them, beloved. Gabriel stood there for a long time without speaking. Thad stood beside him and waited, because he'd learned in the last few weeks that Gabriel's silences had different kinds, and this one needed room. Then Gabriel moved to Jonah Miller's stone. Simpler, older. The grass around it not as well tended as the others, because nobody had tended it. There had been nobody to do it. He took off his hat. "I was wrong," he said, out loud, to the stone, and to the boy beside him, and to the valley around them. "I was wrong to look at you and only see my own loss. You aren't your father's ghost, son. You're your own man." Thad looked at the stone, at his father's name cut into the granite. His jaw worked. Then he crouched down and pulled some of the longer grass away from the base of the stone with his hands, clearing the edge of it, tidying what had been untended. He worked slowly and carefully, and Gabriel crouched beside him. Left side careful, the wound still talking, and helped. They worked at it together until the stone was clear. Gabriel stood and looked at the boy. "I'd like to make it legal," he said, "if that's agreeable to you." Thad looked up at him. "An adoption," Gabriel said. "Your name would change or it wouldn't. That's your choice to make. But you'd have a home and a family and someone who is responsible for making sure you eat enough, which you currently don't." Thad's expression moved through several things in quick succession. He was 12, and he'd been passed between families who didn't want him, and he'd learned to be careful with wanting things, because wanting led to getting, and getting led to losing, and losing led to the bruised posture of a boy ready for bad news. "Ryder's a good name," Thad said finally. Gabriel looked at him. "It is," he said. "Miller is too." Thad thought about it. "Thad Miller Ryder," he said. Both, Gabriel said, and put his hand on the boy's shoulder. He left it there. The juniper trees made small sounds in the afternoon wind. 2 stones in the ground with their names on them. 2 people whose deaths had shaped the living for 10 years, now finally given the full truth of what had happened to them. It wasn't justice that brought them back. Nothing did that. But it was something, the kind of something that let the living stop bending under a weight that was never theirs to carry. The barn raising started at 7 in the morning and ran until the sun went down. Moira had organized it. Nobody had asked her to. She'd simply appeared at the broken wheel on Monday with a list and a look that didn't invite discussion. And by Tuesday evening, the materials were sourced, and the day was set, and 14 families from across Ridgefield Valley had committed to show up with tools and food and willing hands. They came. All of them. The livery man and his 2 sons. The dry goods owner. 3 families from the South Range who hadn't spoken more than 10 words to Eudora before this morning. The valley ranchers who'd stood in the general store and watched the truth come out. Sim Yarnell came in a wagon and sat in a chair near the work site, directing advice at anyone within earshot with the authority of a man who'd spent 60 years building and moving things. They built the cabin first. The foundation was soundstone didn't burn, and Gabriel's best carpenter had spent 3 days cutting timber so that the framing could go up quickly. By noon, the walls were standing. By 4 o'clock, the roof was on. By evening, the door was hung on proper hinges, and the window frames were square, and a new porch ran the full front length of the building, with enough room to sit 2 chairs and still walk past. The lean-to went up in the afternoon, rebuilt solid, and larger than the old one, with a proper door that latched from the inside. Nobody said anything about who'd been sleeping in the old one. Some things were understood without being spoken. Eudora worked alongside the builders all day, hauling lumber and holding beams and making sandwiches at midday out of the food people had brought, which was extraordinary in its quantity. Moira had brought 3 pies. 2 other women had brought enough cornbread to feed the whole county. By the time they stopped for the midday meal, the food table was longer than the porch. Gabriel worked too, at tasks that didn't require his left arm, and Eudora watched him from the corner of her eye and didn't say anything about it. He was careful. He knew his limits better now. He'd do. Thad carried, fetched, held, climbed. He was everywhere at once, quick and focused. And 3 of the men from the South Range called him by name by the end of the morning and meant it. By evening, Cedar Creek looked like a place that had been there 100 years and intended to be there 100 more. The wedding was Gabriel's idea, which surprised her. He'd proposed 3 weeks prior, during his recovery at Moira's, in the characteristically economical way he did most things, sitting up in the bed, with his chest bandaged and his color still poor, looking at her while she changed the dressing, and saying, "I'd like to ask you something." She'd looked up. "All right, marry me," he said. It wasn't framed as a question, but his face was open in a way she'd only seen it a few times and was still learning to read. "I know that's direct. I'm not. I don't have much practice with the other way." "Direct is fine," she said. "Is that a yes?" "It is," she said, and went back to the bandage, and when she glanced up again, he was looking at the ceiling with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Unguarded. Light. So the wedding happened at Cedar Creek, at the new gate at the entrance to the property, just before the light went gold in the late afternoon. The preacher from town did the words. Moira stood beside Eudora. Thad stood beside Gabriel. There were no elaborate decorations. The land was decoration enough. The red canyon walls to the east, the mountains going purple to the north, the new cabin white pine pale in the evening light. The people who'd spent the day building stood in a loose crowd at the edge of the yard. It was simple and clear and true, which was the right way for anything involving Gabriel Ryder. When it was done, and people were starting toward the food table, Gabriel looked at the gate. The original sign had been there when Eudora arrived, old weathered wood, with Cedar Creek barely legible. The paint sun-faded to almost nothing. She'd meant to replace it and hadn't gotten to it. Gabriel had apparently been thinking about it for a while. He went to the wagon where he'd stowed some tools and came back with a hand plane and a length of new pine board and the branding iron from the broken wheel. He set the board on the gatepost and began working it smooth with the plane, the long, even strokes of a man who knew his tools. Thad came over and watched. Then Eudora came over, and the 3 of them stood at the gatepost in the evening light, the crowd behind them going warm with conversation and the smell of food, while Gabriel worked the wood down to a clean surface. He handed the branding iron to Thad. "Heat it," he said. Thad held it in the small fire one of the hands had built for the evening gathering until the tip glowed right. He brought it back. Gabriel positioned the iron and looked at Eudora. She leaned in and set her hand alongside his on the handle. Thad put his hand on the other side. They pressed it together. The letters went deep and clean into the pale pine. Cedar Creek Ranch, 1883 G-E-T-R. Gabriel, Eudora, Thad, Ryder. They stepped back and looked at it. The crowd behind them had gone quiet without anyone asking them to. The specific quiet of 50 people watching a right thing happen and knowing it. Then Gabriel laughed. It was the same laugh she'd heard the first morning when she'd been singing badly in front of her ruined garden. That large, genuine sound that came from somewhere real in him. But it was different now, fuller, like a room with more air in it. He laughed at the sign and at the day, and at the 3 of them standing at this gate, with their hands still on a branding iron. And Thad grinned, a real grin. The unguarded kind that a 12-year-old produces when he's forgotten for a moment to be careful, and Eudora started laughing too. The crowd laughed with them, and the sound went up into the Arizona evening and moved out across the scrubland and into the canyon and came back. Later, after the food and the talking, and after Thad had fallen asleep in the new lean-to that was his by name indeed now, Eudora stood on the new porch and looked at the valley. The mountains to the north were dark shapes against a sky full of stars. The fire the hands had built was burning low at the edge of the yard. Gabriel was beside her. She thought about Ohio, about a parlor in Columbus and a debt that wasn't hers, and a door she'd walked out of because everything worth having was on the other side of the walking. She thought about 30 dry acres and a dead well and $12.40. She thought about what was under those 30 acres. The aquifer the federal survey team had confirmed 3 weeks ago, an underground spring connecting both valleys that would be developed under cooperative water rights held jointly by the valley's ranchers, Cedar Creek included, now that Montgomery's monopoly claim had been dissolved. Clean water, running through land she owned, shared with neighbors, because sharing was what made a valley instead of a collection of fences. She thought about what Ridgefield Valley had been for 10 years, under the weight of a lie, and what it was becoming now. Gabriel's hand found hers on the porch railing. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains. His face was quiet and open in the way it had been getting more often. Not a performance of peace, but the actual thing settling in gradually like water finding level. The frontier can be harsh and barren, she thought. She'd known that coming in. She knew it better now. She'd hauled water on a sled and lost a garden to a bull, and stitched a bullet wound by lamplight, and climbed a canyon in heavy boots, looking for a truth that was 10 years old and overdue. But when people honor one another's dignity, stand up for the truth, and dare to love, even the driest stone will yield a garden. She looked at the new sign at the gate, pale pine in the firelight. 3 sets of initials, pressed deep and permanent into the wood. She looked at the mountains. She held on to Gabriel's hand, and let the stars be enormous, and the valley be quiet, and Cedar Creek be exactly what it was. A place that had been broken and rebuilt, and was, in all the ways that mattered, home. There's something about the frontier that strips everything down to what's real. No pretense, no borrowed titles, no family name to hide behind. Just the land, the sky, and whatever you're actually made of when things get hard. Eudora Vance arrived in Ridgefield Valley with $12, a medicine chest, and 30 acres of dry land that couldn't even produce a cup of water. By every practical measure, she had no business being there. And yet she stayed. She hauled water 3 miles on a wooden sled. She stitched wounds in a room full of people who thought a poor cowboy didn't deserve the chair he was sitting in. She said out loud, what everyone else had decided wasn't worth saying that a person's worth has nothing to do with how full their pockets are or how clean their boots look. She said it plainly. She meant it completely. And she kept meaning it every single day after that, through a burned cabin and a bullet wound and a $1,000 debt, weaponized against her by a man who'd never once been told no. That's the first thing this story gives you. The reminder that dignity your own and everyone else's isn't something you protect only when it's convenient. It's something you stand up for in the middle of a crowded room when the easier thing would be to look back at your plate. Eudora never looked back at her plate. Then there's Gabriel, 14 miles north, sitting alone on a dark porch, looking at stars he no longer felt any particular connection to. 10 years of silence, 10 years of a grief so total. It had stopped being grief and become something closer to identity. He had convinced himself that surviving the flood that took his wife was a kind of failure, that the broken leg, the reaching hand, the moment the current was stronger than he was, that all of that added up to a debt he owed the world in suffering. And so he paid it, quietly, every day, by not laughing, by not speaking more than he had to, by looking at a 12-year-old boy with his dead wife's name attached to his history and seeing only the wound, never the child. What brought him back wasn't a dramatic rescue or a perfect moment. It was a woman singing an Ohio folk song badly off-key in front of a ruined garden because she'd decided that feeling sorry for herself was an indulgence she couldn't afford. It was a laugh that surprised even him that came up from somewhere he thought had gone dark for good. And that's the second thing this story gives you. The truth that healing rarely announces itself. It comes sideways. It comes in small, unexpected moments that crack something open before you've had time to brace against it. You don't decide to heal. You just meet the right person at the right moment, and something in you remembers what it felt like to be whole. And then there's Thad, 12 years old. Carrying a name the valley had turned into a verdict. His father's reputation already buried, already unable to defend itself, had become the weight the boy wore on his back every day, in every room, through every bruise, handed to him by children who were only repeating what the adults around them had decided was true. He didn't know the truth about the dam. He didn't know what really happened in the wash that October. He only knew that he believed his father, and that believing something nobody else believes is one of the loneliest positions a person can hold. This story is partly his. It's the story of what it costs a child when adults in power choose their own comfort over the truth. And it's the story of what it means to finally have someone look at you and say, "I heard you the first time. I believed you the first time." That's a sentence that can change a life. Eudora said it without ceremony. She meant it without conditions. And for a boy who had been handed indifference, wrapped in loose change for years, that unconditional belief was the first real solid ground he'd stood on. That's the story. And maybe, in some corner of your own life, you recognize it. This story is a work of historical fiction. All characters, events, and locations depicted are entirely fictional and created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only.